How's that? There we go. My mother always said I had a very loud voice for inside the house, so I feel like mics are not necessary, but I get it. Thank you all. As I was saying, I'm Robert Burton. I direct the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative within the Center for Constitutional Studies here at Utah Valley University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative's inaugural conversation series on civics, ethics, and the good life. Our theme today is Universities in the Public Square, Institutional Neutrality, and Free Speech. I want to extend a warm welcome to students, faculty, and staff, and to other university leadership who are in attendance. Particularly, I wanted to thank Brian Birch, Director of the Center for the Study of Ethics, Matthew Brogdon, Director of CCS, and all friends of the center joined here today. This series is generously sponsored by the Provost's Office, the Center for the Study of Ethics, the Center for Constitutional Studies, and UVU's Heterodox Academy Community Campus Chapter. Please join me in thanking them. The purpose of the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative is to develop the next generation of citizens and civic leaders by cultivating the knowledge, skills, dispositions, and virtues necessary for a just, free, and flourishing constitutional republic. This new conversation series furthers that purpose by bringing together two scholars or thought leaders, such as we have today, to model the civic virtue of civility, while deeply disagreeing and perhaps finding some common ground on a topic that is ethically rooted and civically relevant. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce one of our Tocqueville Fellows, who will then introduce our discussants for today. The Tocqueville Fellowship is an incredible opportunity for you students here for students to develop themselves as citizens and civic leaders. Gabby Erickson is a junior from St. George, Utah, majoring in political science with an emphasis in peace and justice studies. Gabby is currently a Tocqueville Fellow with the Center for Constitutional Studies, and I'll turn time over to her.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. It's my pleasure to introduce today's discussants. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Ruth, a professor in the School of Film at Portland State University. At Portland State, her research and teaching have covered wide intellectual ground, including film studies, English literature, and academic freedom. She is the author of Novel Professions, Interested Disinterest, and The Making of the Professional in the Victorian Novel, and co-author with Michael Berube of the Humanities, Higher Education, and Academic Freedom. Three necessary arguments, and It's Not Free Speech, Race, Democracy, and the Future of Academic Freedom. She is also the co-editor of A Right to Learn, Resisting the Right-Wing Attack on Academic Freedom, which officially comes out tomorrow. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Keith Whittington, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of the Politics in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He has published widely in the fields of American constitutional theory, political thought, and history. He is the author of and editor of over a dozen books, including Repugnant Laws, Judicial Review of Acts of Congress from the Founding to the Present, and Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. His latest book, The Impeachment Power, The Law, the Politics, and Purpose of Extraordinary Constitutional Tool, will be available later this year. After more than 25 years at Princeton, Dr. Whittington will be leaving this fall to join the faculty at Yale Law School. Our moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Andrew Bibby, the Associate Professor of Political Science and the Associate Director of the Center for Constitutional Studies here at Utah Valley University. He is also the co-editor of the Heterodox Academy's UVU campus community. On behalf of the Tocqueville Fellows and all our guests, please join me in extending to all a warm welcome.
Well, thank you for those introductory words, and welcome everyone. Before I call on our first speakers, I want to make a brief comment on the importance of our topic today, and then also briefly go over the format for today's session. The The title for this conversation series is Universities and the Public Square, Institutional Neutrality and Free Speech. This is an important and controversial topic. Just this week, 19 students were arrested for trespassing on Pomona College campus after storming and occupying the president's office. A few days ago, the University of Texas at Austin fired a number of professors after the state moved to downsize its DEI units, which had grown from 6 DEI employees just a few years ago to 379 professors working on DEI issues with a budget of $10 million. In December, professors from the university, professors and presidents from Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and MIT were called to testify before Congress. It was a contentious event which apparently unified the country by angering and disappointing everyone equally. The testimony was apparently so bad that it forced the White House to release an official statement condemning the university presidents for failing to do their jobs, specifically for failing to answer the question of whether certain students calling for the genocide of Jews violates their school's codes of conduct. So these are just a few examples of why this discussion matters. Professors, presidents, and students are increasingly being centered in a number of highly charged debates about institutional neutrality, academic freedom, and free speech. I would suggest that this event is important for a second reason. According to recent polling, Americans are now more conflicted about free speech issues than they once might have been. On the one hand, Americans do appear to want their universities to protect free speech and academic freedom. A 2023 poll showed that large majorities of Americans want colleges and universities to protect free speech principles. 3/4 of Americans oppose the idea of administrators restricting books, music, or movies assigned in college courses and syllabi. 70% oppose state government restrictions on course content. But in the same poll, at least 50% of Americans now support new restrictions on student and faculty expression. As an example, 60% of Americans said that professors should not be allowed to invite academic speakers accused of using offensive speech to campus. 50% of respondents said that faculty should not be allowed to teach a curriculum that includes polarizing ideas. 38% is the same poll of Americans think that a professor should not be allowed to conduct a scientific study on a topic that some students find offensive. So, what are we to make of these numbers and recent events on college campuses? What is the role of the modern university in the public square? Fortunately, we have two speakers who have spent a lot of time working on this, writing on this problem. I should mention they have books coming out, each of them on this very topic. And they're going to help us today define the problem and perhaps give us some contrasting perspectives to consider. And so on to our first session. Our speakers will be focusing on one part of this public debate, institutional neutrality. Our guiding question for today will be this. When it comes to hot-button issues in the public, should institutional leaders, including university presidents, be expected to speak out or to remain neutral? Our presenters will each have 5 minutes for opening statements. We will then have about 20 minutes of time for open discussion, at which time I will open up the floor and the microphones to the audience for Q&A. Just a few reminders for the event. First, there will be a pause, a hard stop at 10:50, both to allow students to move on to their next classes and to allow students in from other classes. Second, we invite and encourage questions from the audience and students in particular. If you have a question, raise your hand and someone will find you with a mic. And if you haven't heard this advice before, I'll say it again, it's worth reminding you, please make sure your question includes a question. And with that, please join me in welcoming our guests. And let's start with Professor Whittington, who will lead us off. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So my plan is to stay seated for the opening, since we'll continue our conversation from Q&A from here. So I just want to very briefly lay out a couple of basic concerns I have about the institutional neutrality question to help set the table for a further conversation. I think one starting point is to emphasize that it's crucial that universities be places that can engage the public sphere. The question is, how do we engage with those conversations and ideas and activities more generally? From my perspective, it's crucial that members of the campus community, faculty, students, and administrators have ample space and authority to be able to speak out as individuals about issues of concern with them, including deeply controversial issues of public concern more generally. And that there be spaces on campus in which it's possible to have those conversations, including extremely controversial and difficult conversations in general. And I expect, moreover, the faculty ought to have ample freedom to be able to speak out not only in their own voice as individuals, but also to speak collectively in the form of petitions or collective letters or other kinds of vehicles by which they want to express themselves as groups who share common views, as well as speaking as individuals in common views. All of which sort of sets aside the question of what ought to happen in the classroom and research, which was noted some in the introduction. But for these purposes, I'm mostly concerned with speaking about matters of politics and social controversy from perspective of personal opinions that faculty and others might have about those issues, as opposed to people's teaching and scholarship as such. The institutional neutrality question, on the other hand, goes to the question of what role should university officials, as officials, have in speaking out upon those same issues, and to some degree as well, to what degree should institutional arms of the university, including potentially university departments, be able to speak out and issue statements on those issues as well. And on those, I think there ought to be sharp restrictions on what kinds of political statements university presidents issue as university presidents, what kind of statements universities in their institutional voice speak about and issue, including ultimately what kinds of statements university academic departments issue in their institutional voice, again, as opposed to individual members of the faculty in those departments speaking out in their own individual voices, separate from their role as institutional players as such. And my concern here is primarily twofold. One set of concerns I have relates primarily to external audiences, which is to say the universities are in an extraordinarily difficult situation in our present moment. This is not completely unique. There certainly have been times in the past when universities have been in difficult political environments, but it certainly is true now. That we're in extraordinarily difficult political environments, both in terms of what public opinion looks like surrounding universities, but also in terms of how politicians are thinking about universities. That's particularly true on the right, although not exclusively true on the right. So we are in, I think, a very sensitive political environment for universities in general. And so I think it's incumbent upon universities to be thinking about how do they build greater trust in higher education, how do they demonstrate their utility to society in higher education, and how do they turn down the heat around higher education to the extent possible. And I worry that these kinds of politicized institutional statements primarily turn up the heat and don't do very much to advance the positive benefits of higher education as a whole. Such that when university officials, including university presidents in particular, issue statements on deeply controversial social and political matters, what that primarily then is doing is positioning the university as itself a social activist, as itself a political actor within political debates and political controversies as a whole. And it should not be shocking if the university positions itself that way, that it will be treated that way as well. That other political actors, including politicians and government officials, will treat universities as interested political activists and will attack universities as a consequence of that. It's important for universities to be home for people who can speak to those kinds of issues, to insist that we be able to defend the right and ability of individuals on college campuses to say controversial things. But for the university itself as an institutional actor to take its own role as saying controversial things, I think will put the universities universities in more vulnerable political situations than they otherwise would be. And as a consequence, it will make it harder for them to do their primary task, which is one of educating students on the one hand and maintaining their educational mission, and on the other hand, protecting the kind of freedom for discussing controversial ideas on campus they ought to be able to discuss more generally. But that's a concern about how the departure for institutional neutrality will play to external political audiences that are skeptical about universities more generally and might well be offended by the kinds of political statements university officials and institutions might wind up making. There's a second concern, though, which relates more to an internal audience, primarily an audience of academics and students primarily. And here my concern is somewhat less so actually with the kinds of institutional statements that might arise out of university presidents' offices and more with the kinds of institutional statements that might arise out of faculty senates or departments, academic departments or subunits of the campus more generally, although I think it's also a concern of high university leadership as well, which is a concern about marginalizing those who have dissenting political views on campus as a whole. So I'm in the good situation as a faculty member of already having a tenured position, of not caring very much whether or not my university president agrees with me or disagrees with me about political matters or academic matters, for that matter. I also am in a good situation of having a great deal of confidence that my university leadership and president will both defend my right to have controversial ideas and speak to them, and understands that his own role is not to punish me for disagreements he might have or others might have with my own particular views. Not everyone is so well situated, and moreover, I was not so well situated earlier in my career as well. I would have been in a very different situation if I was, for example, a junior faculty member, an assistant professor, still looking for promotion, still looking for tenure, in which ultimately the decision about whether or not to promote me and keep me at the university was in the hands of both my departmental colleagues and ultimately to the university president himself as to whether or not to keep me on campus. If I am going to have the freedom to be able to speak my own mind about matters of controversial material, not only on the academic space, but also in the public arena more generally, it is essential that I not be worried that the university president is going to deny me promotion and deny me the ability to get tenure and remain in the university because the president of the university disagrees with me about those politics. If the university president is in a mode of issuing political statements of his own, of positioning the university as having an official posture on exactly those specific political issues that I want to speak out as an individual, it becomes increasingly difficult to sustain the idea that then as an individual faculty member, I will have complete freedom to be able to speak out in opposition to those things the university has now stated is inherent in our own commitments, deeply in our own shared and cherished values as a university as such, et cetera. To the extent the university has staked out ground on political issues and said, this is the position of the university, these are essential to our core values as a university, tolerating individual faculty members who might disagree with that becomes particularly difficult. I think that's an issue at the level of university presidents and senior officials. I think it's even more of an issue at the level of departments. And so to the extent that my academic department, for example, issues a statement as a department saying we as a department have a set of political values, here they are, we take these stances on these controversial ideas, any student or faculty member who might disagree with that departmental standard now knows that they are very much marginalized within that department, may well think that they do not actually belong in that department, are not going to be welcomed in that department. And moreover, it may well have professional consequences for them to try to maneuver within that department over time. Better for the department as a whole to maintain a neutral attitude precisely to be able to say, we as a department do not have official views, but we as a department also is a place in which people have diverse views and can express those diverse views inside our department. And we are going to protect those, including people who have minority views within our department, protect the ability of members of our department to express those views, even as we as a unit are not going to take stances on those positions in general. So my concern in general is that departures from that institutional analogy position will both damage the university as an institution, make it a more fragile institution, put it in a difficult political spot relative to the outside world, but also internally will help create a sense of orthodoxy, a sense of conformity that will make it harder for people who are dissenters departures from mainstream views within the university itself, both to articulate those views, to be comfortable articulating those views, and to have professional success within universities that see themselves as not being bound by that sense that the university as such ought to be neutral about those controversial issues.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, Keith. So I think that people might assume that we sharply disagree because probably if you can try to discern our personal politics out of what we write and say, we probably don't vote similarly or are quite different. But here's where we do agree on the fact that personal politics shouldn't play any part in, when we hire somebody, we don't say, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican, right? The universities are supposed to be seeking truth. It's a nonpartisan activity, right? However, I think the luxury of worrying about whether a particular faculty member feels like her opinion on Dobbs, say, isn't welcome in her department, that luxury is gone. And I also think it was extremely overblown. And I can come back to that. I think that, Dr. Beebe mentioned that the 70% of people, the American public, don't think that governments should be restricting and controlling curriculum. But then he also mentioned some ways in which it seems like the younger generation is quite willing to restrict speech. From my vantage point, I'm in Portland, Oregon, which has a certain kind of reputation, right? And I have been living through the George Floyd stuff, living through all of this stuff, and it's been very overblown. There are cases, I've followed the cases very closely when someone says something that they absolutely should not have been disciplined for, a faculty member, I'm speaking mostly about faculty member. Faculty member gets disciplined, for example, there's the guy, I can't remember, it's California school, but he was explaining to his students, you may be familiar with this, he was explaining to his students, he's a linguistics professor, he was explaining what the equivalent to is in Chinese, which is a word that sounds similar to the N-word, and he got suspended and pulled out of his class. That's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. That's an overreach, that's an overreaction, that's maybe catering to students who misunderstood or possibly willfully misunderstood it at a certain point. Those kinds of individual cases, though, became the absolute pet of media. And there was a media ecosystem that was looking for Oberlin, the banh mi controversy. Oh, there's students at Oberlin who think that it's cultural appropriation to have certain kinds of foods in the cafeteria. That became really, just in the way that Trump, the news media had trouble figuring out how to handle Trump in the beginning. He was a novelty. He increases ratings hugely. We're going to cover him. We're going to cover him. By the time he becomes a serious candidate, all of a sudden new issues are arising for journalists. There's a similar kind of dynamic about higher ed, where each of these cases becomes fascinating and salacious, and it misrepresents the bigger picture. So to go back to where I am, I don't consider myself, I'm probably left of Keith, but I don't exactly know, right? I don't know if he's pro-choice or what, I don't know these things, and it doesn't matter. But I'm not radical. I'm not a radical. I've misgendered my students. I've called one black student by another black student, saying, no, nothing has happened to me. That is by and large, if you have some kind of flexibility in the classroom, if you pedagogically have any kind of skill in the classroom, you're creating a community of learners, and you're working with them. And if you make a mistake, personally, I don't think that if I want to presume that someone's biological sex doesn't correspond to the pronouns that they're asking me to use, I'm going to use the pronouns they're asking me to use. That seems like a basic courtesy or respect. So if I mistakenly misgender, which I've done, and I apologize, it's fine. Nothing happens. Now, there are cases, and I was telling Keith that I was the faculty steward for a number of years with faculty who are under investigation at Global Diversity. Our office was called Global Diversity and Inclusion. So I know that there was excesses, and I know that there were individual, really heartbreaking cases and really acts of injustice. But the press really loved those stories. They really, really did. And it created, from my vantage point, my perspective, it created an environment that we're in today that is very dangerous. Because what it did is it created a narrative about higher ed that I think there are a lot of variables for the decline in trust in higher ed. A big part of that is expense and student debt. A big part of that is the resentment of 70% of the professoriate who don't have access to job security or a decent salary, who are term-to-term instructors. There's loads of reasons for people to resent higher ed. Legacy admissions, the idea that Princeton admits 8% students. Portland,
Less probably.
less probably than 8%. Portland State probably admits 75%. Where you're going to, mobility is so determined by that filter. There's loads of reasons to be mad at higher ed. But the narrative that it's this a plague of illiberalism is on our campuses has been so successful. So successful to the point at which politicians are saying, we have every right to come in and course correct from a narrative that I think was quite exaggerated. Course correct and control curriculum, enforce. We're going to have the students. The other thing that's interesting about this too is that there's a lot of money now, this being one of them, and I'm appreciative of being here, but this being one of them, of money for teaching students civics. It's not our students that say things like, you just got to grab them by the pussy. Right? It's not the students who talk like that. I'm not quite sure why we need to be disciplining the students when the toxic discourse among politicians is so extreme. Take Chris Ruth, and I will talk about institutional neutrality. I will get to it. But I'm actually trying to get to, there seems to be an anticipation of differences and disagreements. So I'm trying to mine that field a little bit. Unfortunately, because I care about academic freedom, and I care about institutional autonomy, I do spend a lot of time following. I'm not on social media myself, but I do check Chris Rufo's X thread and other people like that. It's a complete war, siege. The language, the metaphors are all about a battle, toughness. And globally, we have the rise of the strong man and authoritarian politics. The new right movement, not the old right, the new right movement is very much in line with that. We've got to be tough. We've got to come down into New College, be appointed by a governor, come down, fire the president, deny tenure to scientists who are not, there's a very concerted conservative activism that's trying to restructure higher ed from the outside. A fundamental value of higher ed in a democracy is seeking truth that's not directly partisan controlled or market controlled. We get this sort of entitlement. It is a kind of entitlement, buffered from the market and from politics with a little bit of distance, precisely so that the knowledge that we pursue isn't controlled by the outside and has a certain amount of credibility because of that. That creates democratic competence. Robert Post is a legal scholar at Yale, and he distinguishes between democratic legitimation and democratic competence. And he says in a democracy, democratic legitimation requires that everyone have free speech. The First Amendment. We have to be able to say what we think. We have to be able to have, in our society, given the way that media works, given all sorts of things, it's hard now. That's another place of apathy and resentment that leads to a kind of burn it all down mentality. But it's hard to believe that your voice is going to sway public opinion in a democracy, right? But we have to at least have that possibility that we can say what we want. When I've traveled in China, I've done a number of Fulbrights in China, and I could say, I think my president is stupid, right? And I can say that. My Chinese students couldn't say, I think Hu Jintao or whoever it was, Xi Jinping, is stupid. They couldn't publicly say that. That was a huge value. That made the Chinese students really envy. Freedom is real. Freedom is real in America because she's not high up in the political apparatus, and yet she seems to be very free to speak her mind. So that's democratic legitimation. We believe we're in a democracy because we can say what we think. Democratic competence is what citizenry need in order to make decisions about who they vote for, et cetera. So if you have a scientist, if you have corporate interests that also, let's say, this is a really crude but obvious, it's crude because it's obvious. There are many more nuanced examples. But let's say you have a company that's toxins are seeping into the wastewater, and you have scientists who are doing research on that. That company also donates a ton of money to the politicians and the university itself. and they can say, no, we don't want you to study that. Then the citizenry don't have access to information about the environment that they need to have. China, I can come back to China. The citizens in China don't trust that the air pollution index is honest in China, right? You need experts. You need people who have expertise in the areas, which professors do, and pursue truth. So to come back to institutional neutrality, I seem to be being called because I wrote something called the uses and abuses of the Calvin Report. The Calvin Report is often what people point to when they're thinking about institutional neutrality. It was a report that was commissioned and undertaken in 1967 at the University of Chicago. And it argues similarly to what Keith argued in terms of universities need to be big tents in which universities need to have dissent, plurality of views, really work through ideas in order to winnow out the false from the true, et cetera. And if an administrator at the top puts their thumb on the scale, that might actually suppress some of the kind of speech and debate that needs to happen in order to pursue truth. That's the broad premise of the Calvin Report. Unfortunately, they use the word neutrality. I don't think personally, I think institutional restraint. I'm not going to sit here. I feel like I'm being invited to sit here and say, presidents should speak out on every possible topic. I don't think that. I think institutional restraint, I think it's really dangerous, especially right now. Which brings me back to why I have deep, deep concerns about the popularity of institutional neutrality right now. The fact that it's become a topic that some of you probably, it's kind of wonky, really. Should be pretty wonky for students to be like, institutional neutrality, administrators speak, what does that have to do with? It should be pretty wonky, but it's now everywhere in the water. And that worries me hugely because it prepares the ground, and I am going to say something kind of dramatic now. If I can get rid of my dry mouth. It prepares the ground for the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. I mean it though. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. So we're in a situation, Project 2025, where if Trump is elected in November, he's going to be much more organized, in part because there's a coalition of 100 organizations that are much more organized and have done the work for him to fill out his civil service. The civil service, historically in a democracy that is expected to change hands regularly. It's not so gerrymandered that you can anticipate that one party is going to be in power in perpetuity. You're supposed to be able to anticipate that you're going to change hands, and we do need to have all these we need to run a country. We need a lot of experts. And we can't be constantly saying, who did you vote for, who did you not vote for, you're out, you're in. There has to be a good, stable base, right? That's the swamp to the Heritage Foundation. That's the swamp to Trump. That's our experts. And they're going to be wiped out and instead filled with political appointees. That will happen at the state, national, by state I mean the state as a whole, not states, national level. It's also happening at the university level with political appointees on boards who have become much more activist. Chris Ruffo, who I mentioned before, who does consider himself, he considers institutions having been captured by the woke. I'm at the capital of woke, and I don't know what he's talking about. I really don't, other than we have some my daughter is not non-binary, but she looks really butch, and so people are always like, what are her pronouns? So I'm in the world of woke. But it's not the way that it gets painted. He has a narrative that I think is self-serving, that institutions have been captured, and so we have to course correct them. We have to come in, the long arm of the state has to come in, throw out those 60 UT Austin faculty who have some relationship who worked on, for example, there's a heartbreaking, Aquasia Shaw is a sports kinesiology professor at UT Austin who just got her pink slip. She does not do DEI, but she has written about race in relationship to sports culture. And now she's out. So the long arm of the state telling telling presidents who they have to get rid of, presidents of universities, right? So my fear about institutional neutrality right now is when does it turn into, is that it lays the groundwork pretty nicely for quietism. It lays the groundwork pretty nicely for compliance. And we're in a moment in which compliance might turn into complicity. And I'm very worried about that. So the more we all say, yeah, we're all for institutional neutrality, November comes along, and we're not going to argue that, hey, no, you don't get to decide who I hire and who I fire. At the very least, let the president and the provost, even then, for faculty governance, we would disagree. And I think Keith and I would agree. If you're an engineering faculty, you don't want the literary critic provost deciding whether your work is any good, right? You want other engineering people across the country to be deciding it. So now we're in a situation where businessmen, politicians, right-wing think tanks are being appointed to boards and deciding who gets to teach and who doesn't get to teach. That's the end of independent university that can provide democratic competence for a citizenry who then can make decisions based on knowledge that they know wasn't directly controlled. We can no longer say that we're not directly controlled in the future that we're headed towards, and that I'm very afraid of, and that I think we need to prepare for. And I worry that the conversation around institutional neutrality does not prepare us well for it.
Thank you both. I do want to get to student questions, so I'll just ask one question. To follow up, I'm glad you mentioned the Calvin Report. So one of the things that the Calvin Report does is that it sets out a pretty ambitious attempt to define the purpose of a university. It's the discovery and dissemination of knowledge. And one of the famous quotes from it is that universities should be the home of the critic, but not the critic.
Yeah.
It also has that other famous quote that university education should be, like Socrates, upsetting.
Yes.
But at the end of the Calvin Report, it also says this is a point of departure. So my question for you two is, do you still think that the Calvin Report is a useful point of departure? Maybe we could explore some possible differences. How useful is it to us today when thinking about institutional neutrality? So I'll start with Professor Whittington.
I think it's a useful point of departure still. I think it lays out a lot of the core concerns from the 60s. I think it's reflective of a particular University of Chicago culture that was true of their history in ways that was not as true of a lot of other universities, and a lot of universities have been quite reluctant to adopt the kind of principles that were articulated by the Calvin Report. I should note I have a book coming out next year, an edited volume with a range of chapters and essays talking specifically about the Calvin Report, currently titled Revisiting the Calvin Report in the fall. And precisely because I think we think it's still a useful starting point for thinking through these kinds of issues. Among the things, though, that didn't come up that's worth mentioning is one thing the Calvin Report wanted to emphasize was that university should be neutral about controversial social and political matters in general, but it can't be neutral about its own commitment and mission. The university has a responsibility to defend its own mission in the public arena, and to the extent its own mission is being challenged, it has a responsibility to stand up and defend it. So to the extent that there are challenges to academic freedom, for example, or intellectual freedom, universities continue to have, even under this sort of institutional neutrality approach, a core responsibility to be able to articulate and defend this. At Chicago, at the time it was being written in the 60s, this was a particular concern of thinking about the lesson of Nazi Germany, where precisely the concern was to say, well, look, if you have the rise of a Nazi party movement, for example, that wants to capture the universities and restrict what can be done in universities, it's important that universities recognize they have a responsibility to resist those kinds of pressures. They can't be neutral about that kind of question. So there are still, and I think there's interesting questions about sort of how should we think about those kinds of exceptions and qualifications, how big are they to that commitment to neutrality. There's also a question about how far do you extend the scope of neutrality across university activities. So part of what gave rise to the Calvin Report in the first place was a question about divestment of the university endowment from outside businesses. This has been an ongoing controversy, lots of universities and lots of different issues over time about to what extent should university investment policy take into account political concerns of those on campus in various ways. The Calvin Report specifically said that investment policies ought to be politically neutral about how those investment decisions are made. But it specifically said we're not going to extend this across a range of other kinds of activities you might imagine. You can imagine, for example, questions about giving honorary degrees to people, which often are precisely about honoring somebody, to say this is a person who's a good person, and often precisely because of their own political activities and the like. And so there's questions about if you really imagine a neutral university, not only does that extend potentially to things like what kinds of statements ought to be issuing out of the president's office, it also potentially extends to things like investment policies. It also potentially extends, though, to things like what kinds of activities should be allowed on campus and what should they look like, et cetera, including these kinds of things like honorary degrees. So there's lots of, I think, difficult things to unpack around the margins once you sort of go down this road of really trying to think through what are all the implications of saying the university ought to be more neutral. My core concern, though, really is just to say that when it comes to making institutionalized statements about political matters, that's the thing we most ought to be centrally concerned with about being neutral about, but again, specifically not relating to intellectual freedom and the core mission of the university itself.
The problem is, though, we're already in that territory and administrators are not comfortable speaking out because it could be withdraw federal funding and state funding. So we've been in the territory in which politicians are saying what can be taught and what can't be taught for a couple of years now. The title of the book that I co-edited is called The Right to Learn. Interestingly enough, Keith's new book is called You Can't Teach That. On the question of whether the state should be interfering with what we teach, we completely agree. And the Calvin Report does say if the mission of the university is attacked in some way, it's the obligation to speak up, but it hasn't been happening, right? There was apparently, thanks to someone in the audience, I saw the Salt Lake Tribune article that came out April 1st that says, after DEI, what's next? And Utah Valley president said something about how that's not, DEI doesn't work like that, and I'm worried about what's happening. Starting maybe to speak out, but have not been. And my concern is that with all of the conversation, that it's a bit of a distraction that does lay the groundwork for a kind of tilt towards, neutrality is going to tilt us towards compliance. It's not going to tilt us towards fighting, despite what the Calvin Report says. I also think it's silly that the Calvin Report mentions the stock portfolio, the corporate portfolio of the university. That was an attempt to say, you know what, students, I know you want us to divest from apartheid South Africa, but we're not changing our stock portfolio. Robert Post, a legal scholar, says it's kind of a specious or possibly disingenuous claim that how they organize your stock portfolio is going to make someone not feel like they could speak out against apartheid South Africa in their political science class, or can't explore the apartheid nature of South Africa in their 1980s political science. That's a little bit of a reach. It seems like a little bit of a defensive, disingenuous posture in order to create a wall between students and the administration and a kind of buffer or defense mechanism. So, I think it's no accident that the push for neutrality, the resurgence of discussion around the Calvin Report is happening now, especially after October 7th, and pushes to boycott, divest, and sanction. I think it was starting earlier with George Floyd. I think one of the other major problems with the Calvin Report is that it doesn't provide any kind of formula that is a kind of standard that can be universalized, by which I mean I've listened to Tom Ginsburg on the Calvin Report, and he thinks it's insane. Tom Ginsburg is a University of Chicago legal scholar who also talks a lot about the Calvin Report. And he thinks it's insane that Carol Christ, chancellor of Berkeley, spoke out after Dobbs and said this is a bad day for women, for half the co-ed population, et cetera. He thinks that's crazy, but he thinks when President Zimmer was in charge of University of Chicago, speaking out against the Muslim ban that Trump was threatening was an appropriate place because it affects the operations of the university. It affects to what extent? What percentage of students? And to what extent do the operations? Do I want my daughters going to Texas for college if they can't have an abortion if they want one? That affects the operations of the, it becomes very messy, very gray what we think. Ginsburg can be very clear, that was a mistake to speak out on, that was not a mistake. I'm going to come down differently. We all are, right? So there's that problem with the Calvin Report.
which is why I'm in favor of institutional neutrality rather than institutional restraint. Because if you say institutional restraint, then exactly you open the door to these kind of debates about should I be restrained in this context or not. My university president at Princeton has also embraced the idea of institutional restraint. He characterizes that as being a longstanding Princeton commitment and cultural tradition as well, despite the fact he was a University of Chicago law student. So also familiar with the kind of stronger neutrality kind of constraint. And partially it's precisely in order to say that he, as a university president, doesn't want his hands tied so that when he feels strongly enough, he wants to be able to speak out. And my concern is, as a faculty member, I'd rather tie hands of presidents and not let them make their own choices about when do they feel that's appropriate for them to speak out and when should they feel restrained. So.
Let's get at least one question from the audience. So we have a few minutes left. We do have sort of a tradition here to ask students or allow students to ask the first question. So if you have a question, put up your hand and wait for the mic.
It's coming down.
It's coming. There you go.
It may be obvious from like the talking, but just to be clear, we're talking about universities as in like colleges and such, like the one we're in right now.
Yes.
Okay, good. That's what I was wondering, just to kind of have further context, because I like to imagine university could be a bit of a gray area, like it could be a university of something else and not necessarily like a school environment.
Yeah, no, I think we're thinking primarily about institutions of higher education primarily. I think we'd even separate, I would certainly think separately, like there are things you might think of as think tanks, research institutions that are adjacent to universities in some ways, but nonetheless have a specific mission that includes advocacy in various ways, and I think they are going to have a different culture and different commitment on this front. Lots of nonprofits obviously have a different kind of commitment. So I think this concern about neutrality and restraint is primarily one about higher ed.
At the back.
My question refers back to the introduction, where you discussed the 70% that say they're all about neutrality, but then it indicated the extent to which maybe respondents were not all that self-aware. So the situation that lost the president of Harvard her job and the president of UPenn her job looked to me like was very much tied into that the presidents were striving not to make statements that would be inflammatory, and they were shoved up against the wall and then, put in a position where resigning was the only course forward. So my question to you is, was there an answer that either of them could have given that would have satisfied maybe it was a rock and a hard place that was so close together that it resulted as we've seen, but is there something they could have said to thread that needle?
I love that question. It keeps coming up. I don't think so. I think that the sort of what Chemerinsky said, the afternoon quarterback or the armchair quarterback, it's easy to come up with all kinds of things. But it was very McCarthy-esque, right? Because if you've watched any of the House of Un-American Activities Committee kinds of testimony, people try to say something and they're stopped from saying it. It's a yes or no. It's a yes or no. And it becomes extraordinarily hard to say anything with any nuance. So personally, I find it hard to judge them as harshly as it does seem like they were universally judged. I also think that it has exposed something about higher ed that was better kept hidden, but that's now very, very exposed, which is the fact that donors and board of trustees can fire presidents. And so what kind of institutional autonomy is that? So yeah, I'm very fond of the context-specific answer, because it's the only honest one.
So I think they were both in a difficult spot. I don't think that I think they both would have had really hard times navigating their own environments, even absent the congressional testimony. So I think they were both already vulnerable even before the congressional committee occurred, and then the congressional committee certainly did not help in various ways. Weirdly, I was giving a talk at some place about campus free speech issues the evening of the congressional testimony, and I had missed the congressional testimony itself, so I didn't see it. So somebody asked me a question at the event of, let me ask you the Stefanik question and see what your answer is on this. And I gave basically the same answer they gave. And so it's like, as it turns out. And so I think part of their problem from the congressional testimony was actually not the content of the answer, but not appreciating the nature of the event they were in and what kind of answer was going to work within that context. Which also means that, you know, my university president declined an invitation to go to that. He had a scheduling conflict, and so they all should have had scheduling conflicts.
That's right.
They would have been better off. Yeah. I do think, though, that part of the challenge, though, that both Penn and Harvard presidents found themselves in is that they were at institutions and they continued that commitment of issuing statements all the time about all kinds of things. Both the Penn president and the Harvard president had issued multiple statements about October 7th. None of those statements were satisfactory to anybody. I think they highlight the difficulty of being in an environment in which you're expected to issue statements in which you're not going to satisfy anyone, and any kind of refusal to issue a statement is going to be read very badly. And so I think they both would have been in a much better situation, both new presidents, and if they would have started their administrations by saying, there's a new sheriff in town and we're not issuing statements anymore. So when October 7th happened, and they would have just said, as I said, we're not issuing statements about this. And so do not read into then not issuing statements about what my views are one way or another. Instead, the demand that both those presidents have and lots of other presidents are now having is the concern is they're treating Jewish students differently than they've treated other students in the past in other kinds of events. And so you should be issuing even stronger, bolder statements. You should be cracking down even more intensely on speech on your campus in response to speech that some are reading as anti-Semitic and the like. Universities have backed themselves into a corner on this stuff, in part because they've been inconsistent about how they've treated free speech issues. And I think Harvard and Penn found themselves in that crossfire in that regard. I don't know if either one of them could have actually navigated that better than they did, frankly. But I think universities as a whole ought to take a lesson from that experience. And I think the appropriate lesson to take out of that experience in part is moving forward, a position of institutional neutrality will save us a lot of headaches relative to some of these issues in the future.
Thank you both for a stimulating conversation to start the day. To learn more, we have 2 books up on the screen here. If you're interested, I think we even have a coupon code for one of them.
Coupon code,
if you're interested, right? Highlighted in orange. But thank you both. We're going to continue the conversation at 11 o'clock. So we're going to take a break now. So let's just join me in thanking our speakers for starting us off on a great day. Thank you.
Well handled. And yeah, what?
Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our Civic conversation series. We won't repeat our lengthy introduction, but we'll turn the time over to our moderator, Andy Bibby, who will take it from here. Thank you. Floor is yours, Andy.
All right, well, thanks again to our organizers, and in particular, the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative at UVU, and our sponsors, including the Provost Office and the Center for the Study of Ethics and Heterodox Academy. We have a packed session, and so I think what I'll do is just briefly introduce our speakers and then get into the discussion. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's discussants. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Ruth, professor in the School of Film at Portland State University. At Portland State, her research and teaching have covered wide intellectual ground, including film studies, English literature, and academic freedom. And next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Keith Whittington, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He has published widely in the fields of American constitutional theory, political thought, and history. For the sake of time, I thought we would just move into our topic for today, no less controversial than the first panel, which is academic freedom. So just a quick note on the format. So we'll ask each of our speakers to present opening statements for 5 minutes. Then we'll have an open conversation, an open dialogue for about 20 minutes, and then we'll turn the time over to Q&A from the audience. So if you have a question, just please put up your hand, and please wait for the mic. And I'll remind you again from the first session, if you do have a question, please make sure that it includes a question. And okay, so with that, we'll start with, let's start with, well, should we flip a coin?
You're the moderator, man. You get to decide.
Okay, we'll start with Dr. Ruth.
Okay.
Academic freedom.
All right. So apologies to those of you who were in for the first hour, because there's probably going to be some overlap with what I say, because I'm going to speak to the difference, since we're doing academic freedom now, not institutional neutrality, the difference between free speech and academic freedom. So the book that I have that I've co-edited that's coming out tomorrow is very much about the political interference in higher education, and that was what leads me to my concern about institutional neutrality ending up being institutional quietism and complicity. But my book in 2022, which I co-wrote with a friend of mine, Michael Berube, who's at Penn State, is called It's Not Free Speech, Race, Democracy, and Academic Freedom. And we wrote the book because we were concerned about the conflation of free speech and academic freedom, and the sense that they're basically one and the same. And there was a lot of confusion about whether they are any different, not just the general public, but also faculty ourselves. So oftentimes you'll see free speech and academic freedom just sort of yoked together and just talked about as if they're just a package. But they're actually quite different, and the difference matters, particularly for the moment that we're in today. Free speech is the First Amendment. So I'm going to invoke Robert Post again. He has a book that has been really important to me, his 2012 book, Democracy, Expertise, and Academic Freedom. It's a pretty bland title, something like that. But in that book, he makes the case that the First Amendment is required for us to feel like we can speak our minds in a democracy. We're not being censored or hampered. We can sway public opinion if we speak well, and particularly. Academic freedom has a very murky and sometimes downright counterproductive grounding in constitutional law. Academic freedom has been called a special concern of the First Amendment. It gets invoked, and there's some famous rulings where it gets invoked, but the standing for it in law is not strong. And actually, I want to ask Keith how he puts it on stronger grounding, and you can't teach that, because it sounds like you can't teach that is an attempt to give more constitutional support to academic freedom. And it's a real shame that he didn't write that book 5 years ago, right? Because we're at this moment where academic freedom having a very murky, it's really a procedural thing. It was built up by American Association of University Professors starting in 1915, and it was comes out of I'm saying but maybe you don't know, because not everyone loves this stuff. But so there's a professor who was fired for speaking out about a political issue, and Leland Stanford's wife insisted that it offended her, and she insisted he be fired. And the American Association of Professors essentially, and their 1915 statement comes out of that, an attempt to say, we need to have some independence from board members, from donors, from somebody who's going to be offended. It's the beginning of academic freedom. And the way you then create it is this sort of horizontal review. Like I mentioned before in the earlier hour, engineering professors can evaluate engineering professors. Literary critics cannot evaluate engineering professors. So you have to have a certain amount of expertise in the conversation to begin with to evaluate one another. And that is a kind of guardrail we see now. It's a kind of guardrail from a Manhattan Institute, Chris Rufo documentary, whatever his experience is. It's not in film studies. I don't want him deciding whether I'm aligned with his mission or not for New College, right? So academic freedom is really for the professoriate. And before this moment of political interference, there was a lot of push to say, and partly because of the narrative that universities are spaces in which speech is chilled, there was a lot of push to say students have academic freedom too. No, they have First Amendment, and they have the right to make mistakes in classrooms, because that's what they're there for. They have the right to, hopefully they're going to say what they think and then maybe change their mind or maybe learn how to say more persuasively what they think, right? But that's First Amendment. That's not academic freedom. Academic freedom is this infrastructure that has been built up over decades that's now quite in tatters of the tenure system, the hiring, the search committees. It's not, oh, I'm friends with that person who teaches over there, they can get me a job, right? They have to have a search committee. So even if I do know someone over in that university, the search committee might say, well, they're not qualified. It's elaborate procedures, fairly elaborate procedures that create guardrails to make sure that the knowledge that we're pursuing has some degree of independence from things like petty patronage, who you know, who you don't know, what your argument, who it's serving, who it's not serving out in the public sphere. So it's funny to even think that academic freedom is controversial because I'm not sure what anyone means when they throw that term out. I'm not sure if they mean it the same way that I mean it. I don't know if it's controversial or not, but it's certainly under attack by political activism from the right, which is why, and I want to mention too, this book that I co-edited, The Right to Learn, the subtitle is Resisting the Right-Wing Attack on Academic Freedom. It's incredibly uncomfortable, believe it or not, to have a subtitle that says right wing or left wing. I'm not comfortable with that. That's the fact that the right wing is now trying to redesign higher education. But in academic freedom circles in general, we don't call out where we are on the political spectrum. So we're in a moment where we have to, because we have to name what's going on, and we have to be honest about where it's coming from. But it's not something that should be happening. Right? We should be able to pursue our disciplines with academic freedom, having nothing to do with who we vote for.
Okay, so let me build on that and fill in a couple of gaps and say something about the constitutional issues associated with this as well as sort of a setup. So as Jennifer noted, right, the academic freedom as it exists in the United States is really a development of the early 20th century, initially pushed by faculty in order to defend their own right as to how they worked in university context, although it's a concept that they themselves are importing from Germany, which had been developing this in the latter part of the 19th century. In 1940, the AUP, the American Association of University Professors, was the organization of faculty that was formed in the early 20th century around academic freedom issues, issues a joint statement with an organization representing universities of a set of 3 core commitments of academic freedom that ought to be recognized by American universities. And it was extraordinarily influential in the United States. So lots of American universities adopted it as part of their own policies and rules about how they conducted their own business. And the 3 core components it committed to was that faculty ought to have freedom of research. That is to say that they ought to be able to pursue their scholarly inquiry and publish the results of their research without the intervention and censorship of university officials. So university presidents shouldn't be able to fire you because they don't like the outcomes of your research. They shouldn't be able to censor you and prevent you from publishing your research because they don't like what you're publishing. And of course, university presidents in this context are mostly stand-ins for pressures from donors, alumni, board trustees, politicians, et cetera, right? So sometimes university presidents themselves have views about these things, but often what they are the vehicles by which other people are upset about things faculty are researching, and then put pressure on university presidents. And the vehicle that university presidents have, the tool that university presidents have, was fundamentally to fire people, but to some degree as well to impose various other kinds of sanctions against faculty. So one, freedom of research with the primary aim of you should not be fired or censored by your university employer for what you are engaged in with your scholarly research. Secondly, freedom of teaching. You should be able to engage in teaching in the classroom and introduce controversial material and ideas relevant to the topic that you're teaching, again, without fear of university reprisal against what it is that you're doing. So you shouldn't be fired by your university if you raise controversial ideas with your students in the classroom, if those controversial ideas are relevant to the subject matter. That's explicit in the text. I think implicit in the text and part of what Robert Post emphasized as well, and the AUP has subsequently emphasized, is this notion that there should be competence about what you're introducing students to as well. So not only, if you're introducing students to controversial ideas in your classroom, not only should they be relevant to the subject that you're teaching, but they also should be within the realm of professional competence. So you shouldn't be introducing your students to crazy, harebrained conspiracy theories that no one accepts, and then telling your students, this is the truth as we understand it in the profession, right? So you have an obligation to communicate to your students who don't know any better what's widely accepted. And if you're going to introduce things that are on the margins or deeply controversial within the profession, you have an obligation to inform students that this is not the mainstream view, but you should be aware of it for this or that reason. Thirdly, there's a concept that's not strictly speaking academic freedom per se, but instead entails in this concept of free speech more generally, which is you ought to have the ability to speak as a citizen freely. So you should go out in public and be able to speak as a professor. You can go out in public and speak at a political rally, on social media or whatever, express your own personal political opinions in that context, again, without being worried about being fired by your university faculty member. The core concern behind all those ideas was universities ought to be places where we can talk seriously about controversial and difficult ideas. Things that the local community, the students, the parents, the alumni, the politicians might find deeply disturbing. They might think that the faculty are communicating ideas that they don't want communicated to students, that they don't like being communicated to students, that they think are evil ideas or wrong-headed ideas in various kinds of ways. And the core concerns of academic freedom is to say, no, universities are exactly places where we talk about those controversial ideas with a goal of trying to advance the truth as best we can. Try to advance knowledge as best we can, and that means grappling seriously with ideas that people might find wrong-headed, ideas that people might find controversial, ideas that people might find challenging in various kinds of ways. And we should be able to do that without outside interference from those who are not expert in the area, trying to suppress the ability of those who are expert in the area to pursue that effort at advancing knowledge over time. Now, this gives rise to all kinds of specific kinds of questions that might come up in this context. So, for example, who should get to choose what books are assigned in a classroom? Should that be the individual faculty member who's teaching the class, or should university presidents have some capacity to intervene and say you can't teach a given book in a classroom? In the early 20th century, one of the fights over that scope of freedom of classroom teaching was precisely over whether or not university presidents could come in and veto texts that university faculty were assigning to students to read. Among those early texts in particular were texts about evolution as applied to humans in particular. So lots of controversies about human evolution and Darwinism as it applied across a range of disciplines. Very common for university presidents, in part through pressure from members of the community, to tell university faculty, you can't teach those ideas in the classes. They're too controversial, too difficult. You can't assign students to read books that communicate those ideas in the classroom, and the university president should intervene and be able to prevent that. The goal of freedom of teaching is to say, no, that's not the university president's job. That's the job of the individual faculty member to make those decisions about what should be taught in the classroom. And the university president not only cannot intervene in that, but also can't punish you for doing something the university president would prefer you not do in those kinds of context. And the core concern there is, again, mostly about employment consequences and mostly relative to university employers, particularly as represented by the university president as the head of the institution that might employ you. Less immediate through a lot of those debates were questions about governmental intervention in what happens in the classroom. So lots of concerns to the extent to which there are political pressures on what might be happening on university campuses. Those political pressures were communicated often informally and indirectly through pressure on university presidents to then fire people over time. So not a lot of direct experience with trying to think about, well, are there any rules so we can develop on our university campus a set of policies and rules and norms about how we ought to behave. We can enter into contracts with faculty, guaranteeing them a certain amount of academic freedom, et cetera. But what if you're at a public university and the legislature wants to come in and override all those commitments and say, no, we're going to intervene legislatively in what happens at the university level? Those individual university level policies and professional norms, et cetera, all can be easily overridden through statute. And then the question is, are there any First Amendment constraints, constitutional constraints that might back up those kinds of professional norms and local commitments that might constrain what legislatures can do? That's very unclear. The US Supreme Court had said some things in the 1960s in particular that said academic freedom concerns are important to the First Amendment because the First Amendment cares about that ability to debate controversial ideas without that kind of political intervention in those ideas. But the Supreme Court has provided very little guidance about how to pursue it. And moreover, the US Supreme Court later has had to grapple with a variety of other doctrines relating to speech in government institutions that complicate how academic freedom might work. So, for example, if you are working in a governmental workplace, your supervisor as a government employee can supervise your work and including can monitor what kinds of memos you write, what kinds of things you say in the government workplace. We expect the government employers to be able to manage people in a government workplace and constrain their speech in various ways. And the US Supreme Court has given lots of leeway to that in saying that when you are a government employee, your First Amendment rights are deeply restricted relative to what you're doing in the workplace more generally, that your supervisors can regulate your workplace speech in various kinds of ways. Somewhat separate for outside speech, but set that aside for the moment, right? That has deep consequences if you extend that to the logic of universities, right? Because now you're saying, well, university president as my supervisor should be able to intervene in my workplace speech, which is to say my classroom speech or my scholarly research, for example, right? And so if you go with that and run with it, then it would really suggest from a First Amendment perspective, there's no real academic freedom protection written into the Constitution or as part of the First Amendment concerns that would protect university faculty in the context of a state university. So part of the challenge for the court now, confronted with things like the Stop Woke Act and other legislative interventions that are designed precisely to restrict what people, in particular, are teaching in state university classrooms, is how to reconcile those two commitments. How to reconcile what they said in the 1960s about the importance of academic freedom to the First Amendment as it being an important First Amendment value on the one hand, with these kinds of doctrines relating to governmental employee speech more generally that they've articulated in subsequent decades. Lower courts have been left struggling with this issue of trying to figure out how to reconcile them. The US Supreme Court has said very little. I think we're now on the cusp of trying to figure it out. I think there are ways of reconciling that. Part of the book that I have coming out next month, You Can't Teach That, is precisely about both trying to walk through why these things matter and what the history of academic freedom is, but also trying to think about the First Amendment issues and how to reconcile those kinds of constitutional problems. But it's not an easy task. I think there's a path there, but it's controversial and unclear as to whether or not we're going to get there. So we have both constitutional questions relating to academic freedom, and we have professional norms and contracts relating to academic freedom. They overlap in terms of what the content and what the core concerns are, but what grounds them and what kinds of protections you might have vis-a-vis state legislatures and politicians, for example, as opposed to vis-a-vis a university president, a private university, remains terribly unclear.
Thank you. I have a question. I want to linger actually on this distinction between academic freedom and freedom of speech. So I think you've both covered it, and then I want to maybe ask you to draw out possibly maybe even some differences that you might have in terms of the gap between those two things. So I know, Professor Ruth, you've given a great example of, well, we don't want an astronomy teacher to be teaching that the moon is made of green cheese.
I took that from Provost.
Right. and Professor Whittington, in other contexts, you've given the example of a geology professor who is teaching not only just flat earth theory, but I'm assuming that he's teaching it in a way that is compelling students to answer that, yes, this is true, that the earth is flat, and so on. So it seems clear in those circumstances that we have a question of competency, which should override other rival or contested things like freedom of speech. My question is, but how do we extend that standard of competency to the social sciences, to the humanities, where it might not be so clear how we assess fitness, as you say, Professor Ruth, or competency? So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
So I think it's not obvious at all, right? And so there's a good reason why we tend to give examples from the natural sciences, because they have much clearer standards, right? And so and clearer understandings about what the scientific method will give you and what kinds of reasons are consistent with it, what the disciplinary norms are. The key is the relevant inquiry that's occurring both in terms of research and in terms of teaching is one within the disciplinary bounds you're particularly engaged in, the subject matter you're particularly doing it in. And so those standards are going to be different if what we're talking about are engineering professors as opposed to philosophy professors. I'm not terribly optimistic that you could identify very clear standards in a philosophy department, for example, as to what would count as incompetent philosophy. I think there's certainly better and worse philosophy. Decisions about you would want to make about who would you want to hire and promote, what kinds of things would you want to publish. But if you actually were to bring somebody up on charges and saying they're engaged in incompetent philosophy in the classroom, it would be a tricky thing. I think given the range of things that are acceptable within the field of philosophy in particular, as to how you would demonstrate that they've gone off the rails in that regard in terms of the particular content of what they're speaking. That's relative to the competence question, right? But the other thing you also see relative to these free speech claims, again, sticking with the classroom context, is a claim of faculty who will sometimes say, look, I have the free speech right to say whatever I want in the classroom, and so if I want to use my metaphysics class to spend half of the class railing about how terrible Donald Trump is, right? That's not a question of competence. That's a question of germaneness. That's a question of, are you teaching the subject matter you were hired to teach? Are you actually using that classroom for the purposes you're supposed to be teaching it? And you certainly have faculty who say, no, that's part of my academic freedom. I have a free speech right to talk about Donald Trump in my metaphysics class if I want to. And that's wrong from an AUP perspective, from a contractual perspective, from a policy perspective. That the university certainly has both a responsibility and a right to intervene and say, no, those students are signed up to learn metaphysics. You shouldn't be spending half your class time teaching something else that they were not signed up for and is inappropriate. And that may be things that are controversial, like your personal opinion about Donald Trump, but it may be things that are not controversial, right? That you want to spend half your time talking about how beautiful butterflies are or whatever, right? So it's, nonetheless, the students are signed up for a particular job, and part of the university's responsibility is to make sure that job is being performed. And part of that means you're subject to certain kinds of workplace management, even as a faculty member. I know faculty don't like to hear that, but even so. And so part of the academic freedom versus free speech concern is precisely to say, when I'm in the classroom teaching, I have certain professional responsibilities in that context. I'm not simply exercising free speech. I'm engaged in something that's professionally bounded by academic freedom concerns and obligations, and that's bounded partially by germaneness concerns and partially by competence concerns. And universities have an appropriate duty and right to discipline me if I'm stepping outside those boundaries.
Yeah, that's part of the sort of, I'm on the left. I'm just saying this now because it's become important to say it given our situation. But I'm flummoxed about the idea that we're indoctrinating. I don't know anyone who is going into their classroom and indoctrinating. That's a basic AAUP principle is you teach, you don't indoctrinate. And what you teach has to be germane to the course. It does get a lot messier and more complex the farther away from hard sciences you get. So for example, I'll give you a conversation that I had with my university president at Portland State, who, and I just want to mention, I hope she doesn't mind my saying this, but it's very obvious to me that college presidents everywhere are running very scared after those hearings. And they want to look like they're cracking down on anti-Semitism because federal investigations are being opened. And the House passed a resolution that said anti-Zionism, which is criticism or being against the Zionist project of founding Israel as a Jewish state, as an ethno-national state, that's anti-Semitic. So there's a lot of debates around definitions, right? So she and I were talking, and one of the lovely things about being at the same place for as long as I have is that you sort of get known for what you know. And you get pulled into, it's both lovely and irritating because you don't get paid more to get pulled into all these conversations. But I get pulled in regularly to talk about academic freedom and free speech stuff. And I pointed out to her, so she was trying to find where the bright line is because there's been complaints about faculty who are talking about settler colonialism in classrooms that maybe that's not the most germane to the topic, right? And I started spitting out for her how complex and messy it is because I teach Film History 2 class, and the way we teach film history 1, silent cinema, is wonderfully international. People can watch Charlie Chaplin because you have the intertitles. It's very easy to change the language on a couple. There's very little speech, right, in silent cinema. So it was very easy to export Charlie Chaplin everywhere and have everybody love him, regardless of the country. By the time you get to sound cinema and you get post-1945, World War II, there's a big national cinema surge. There's new nation states that have been carved out completely new, who are trying to sort of create a sort of retroactive history about who we are as Czechoslovakians that then didn't quite work out, right? It became Czech Republic and Slovakia. But we're trying to figure out our national history. Literature, the arts often get recruited for those national narratives. So film history in the middle period becomes very nation state oriented. So one of the things that I teach the relationship between nationalism, ideology of nationalism, and film during a certain period. And I taught a film by a Palestinian film. I said, what do you do, what kind of film do you teach? What kind of film do you make to define yourself as stateless, right? So we're looking at how this film is trying to construct a certain notion of the nation. But then what do you do if you're stateless? And so then I had to talk about the Nakba. I had to talk about were the settlers coming from Israel, from Europe, or were they already indigenous to the area? And it's not so simple. It really isn't. And so part of what's sad about the tatters of the infrastructure of higher education today is that the whole business of creating a department, hiring people, they have to give talks. You have to see that they can work, that they can speak on their feet a little bit, that they have an ability for complexity. You can't guarantee what they're going to say in the classroom, but you can guarantee that they're not simplistic or crude. And so that, because we're hiring so many faculty simply by a CV that arrives in the department chair's office, and then we need someone to fill this class, and they're getting paid very little to teach this class. We don't have that kind of sense of what each other is doing in the classroom. Kind of quality control, if you will. I hate to borrow that term, but kind of quality control is fallen apart. But from my vantage point at a university that does hire a lot of contingent faculty, I'm not seeing the ham-handedness or the narrative that faculty everywhere, and I'm happy to learn that I'm wrong, and I'm sure there are cases. But the narrative that professors are walking into classrooms and saying, there's oppressors and oppressed, and you fit into one and you fit into the other, that's not my experience of anyone I know. It may happen, but it's not my experience. So the academic freedom part becomes important because free speech gives you the right to be wrong. Academic freedom creates a little bit of quality control. It says, well, no, you have to be competent in your field and you have to be germane to the subject matter. We can evaluate you on those terms and say, no, you can't, you're wrong, and that wasn't germane.
Thank you. I'd love to open it up to the audience for questions. So we do have a tradition of allowing students to ask the first question. So students, I see a hand up here. Just please wait for the mic.
Okay, so for institutional neutrality and free speech and all these dynamics, it seems like there's kind of like a king of the hill dynamic that comes into play.
King of the hill?
Yes. Meaning like all these ideologies, there's like, of ideas that come with that utilitarianism type mindset, doing the best for everybody, that satisfies the biggest pleasure. So the main question I'm asking is, with all these things kind of the same goal but through different means, like what kind of solution would there be for these ideals that we can have? Because it seems like it's not coming through compromise, right? It seems like there's some sense that freedom, like some sort of freedom, will need to prevail. So what kind of solutions will have to come without compromise?
What did you mean by king of the hill?
It's like there's this aspect of like one idea needs to like prevail in a sense.
Wanting what to prevail?
One idea needs to like prevail. For example, institutional neutrality and free speech. There's like a.
Well, there isn't actually a survival of the fittest of ideas. So you have university presidents who say, I'm for institutional restraint, and you have university presidents who say, I'm for institutional neutrality. And it doesn't have to be survival of the fittest on that idea.
Yeah, I think ultimately, right, at the heart of this the way I tend to approach it anyway, is I want to try to think about what are universities trying to accomplish and what kinds of policies and practices facilitate that goal, right, of trying to make universities be able to accomplish the things they're trying to accomplish. And I think there's room on the margins for variation on that. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all that necessarily has to be true everywhere. I do think some pretty robust defenses of academic freedom is going to be essential to realizing that. But there's lots of variations, I think, on some of the specifics. And to some degree that we may be in a moment of starting to experience a lot more divergence across American universities as to how they're organized. I mean, one thing that happened over the course of the mid-20th century is a lot of universities across the United States, whether private or public, regardless of what kinds of state they're in, what kind of public institution they're in, they all tend to converge to look very similar in terms of what they did, how they did it. I think we're starting to see that split apart. We may see a lot more differences among different private universities. We may see a lot of differences between private and public, a lot of differences between different publics and different locations. And so we're going to get more experimentation, I think, as a consequence about what actually works well for university education and what's most compatible with that. And so we may learn that there's a lot more space for a lot more plurality than what we had tended to assume, or we might well learn that some of these ways are going to be a lot better than others about how to do that. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where the question was trying to go. I mean, one issue, though, as well is sort of what kinds of ideas wind up prevailing within the discipline. And it's certainly one kind of challenge within universities. As I noted, sort of this idea of disciplinary competence about what you're doing in the classroom, for example, is grounded in part on the notion of we have a community of scholars within a given discipline with a set of ideas that we take seriously and a set of ideas we don't take seriously within that discipline and on that subject matter. And it's inappropriate to teach students the ideas that we don't take seriously as if they were serious. But there's disagreement sometimes among scholars about what that looks like. And sometimes what you see are new disciplines emerge precisely in order to make space for those things that weren't taken seriously. So one thing that gave rise to women's studies as a field of study within American universities was precisely the idea that there were a lot of issues of interest to women and a lot of ways of exploring those issues that were being marginalized in other existing disciplines, and you needed to carve out entirely new institutional structures in order to support those new ideas, which makes space within the university for doing things that previously the university said that's not competent to do it that way. And now we accept it as being competent to do it that way, but it requires institutional reform to do it. So there's no guarantee universities can get these things right, or that in any given moment our professional knowledge is correct, right? And so one reason why we also like green cheese kind of examples is because we're pretty confident about what the right answers are about those. But there are other things where we don't know that's true, right? And so there are things we currently think are probably true, but part of the nature of academic research and academic knowledge is that the substantive things we think are true are always tentative, always open for debate, always can be changed. It's one of the concerns I have about institutional statements, right? Because they're often about freezing in place a set of commitments and saying this is what we think is true, when it may be precisely the case that 10 years from now we'll think that's not true anymore because we've got new evidence, new arguments, et cetera. And it's a real serious and difficult challenge for universities to simultaneously say we want to consolidate around what we think is true, but we also want to leave ourselves open to the possibility we're wrong. It's a hard human thing to do. It's hard institutionally to do. It's hard for academics to do. But that's at the very core of the enterprise is trying to maintain that balance.
I think we have a question up here, and then we'll come down here next.
What do you, what my understanding, the reason why you follow the government's policy of the academic freedom of speech and such like that is that you receive funding from the government. What words you would say where you believe that the neutrality and the idea of thought would overturn the ability to get government funding? When is government funding less important than the idea of the free thought and making sure that you where the equality of ideas and non-bias is more important than the public funding?
So I should note that right now, most government funding is not tied to an academic freedom commitment. That may well be true in the future. So that's one of the kind of policies that are on the table of trying to tie more government funding to more robust commitments on the part of universities to various kinds of protections for academic freedom and the like. But mostly not now. Mostly for now, those kinds of commitments to academic freedom, et cetera, are local commitments by institutions and professional norms. And notably, some institutions don't buy into that, right? And so we still have, it's definitely a minority of institutions, but there are some institutions that's primarily religious institutions in the United States that say, sometimes we don't believe in this academic freedom thing at all. We'll provide no protections for faculty on our campus for those kinds of protections. Relatively few institutions are willing to do that. Instead, they're much more likely to say, we're going to provide some academic freedom commitments to faculty, but they're restricted and restrained in various ways, in particular by certain kinds of church teachings that on this campus we're going to take as givens and are not open to skepticism, not open to question. You can't teach the opposite of them on this campus, et cetera, and you can be rightfully punished for teaching or researching in opposition to those committed views. A lot of universities, even religious institutions that take that kind of approach are a little weaselly about what kinds of commitment they really want to make on that front. In part because the academic freedom commitments are professionally very strong, and so there's a real desire to want to give some lip service to them, even if you want to carve out these kinds of exceptions. But part of the challenge of those religious institutions is precisely to say, no, there are some ideas that should not be subject to challenge. There are some ideas that we hold as truths that are not to be questioned. And that we're confident enough in that we're going to take outside the bounds of this normal skeptical environment the universities generally operate within. And certainly if you saw, and part of the concern of things like the Stop Woke Act and others is that they represent a kind of legislative intervention into university life in saying there are some ideas that in fact are too politically controversial or we think are wrong in the judgment of the legislature, and we want to take out of the universities. And you should not teach those institutions. Presumably at some point there'll be claims you shouldn't research those and publish on that as well. But right now at least aimed at teaching. Where the claim is precisely, in the judgment of the legislature, these ideas are not only wrong, perhaps evil, socially corrosive, and we do not want faculty in at least state universities teaching those ideas in those state universities. We have not seen much effort yet of state legislatures and others reaching out into private universities in order to say you can't teach those in private universities also, although there's been some policy proposals that would go that direction. I think there are higher First Amendment hurdles to get over if you want to impose that constraint on private universities. But those are regulatory. Those are not currently being tied, at least, to funding. Those are simply being where the legislature simply says you're not allowed to do that. But there's creative mechanisms you could imagine, for example, tying them to say if you're going to take students with federal scholarships, you can't teach critical race theory in your school, for example, which would be a dramatic change, if so, and would force a lot of universities to think very carefully about how they're going to position themselves relative to federal funding if they were forced to make those choices.
The Ivy League presidents were private institutions, and so the threat of withdrawing federal funding is still very real in the private institutions. I want to speak to, it's a little circuitous, but I think it's something that is very much in the water for the last few years around DEI. Keith brought up that women's studies, it was a battle to get women's studies into the university, it was a battle to get Black studies, et cetera. I certainly know that the research, I'm not a College of Education person. I come out of literature and the arts, but there's good research that shows that if you can see yourself in the curriculum in some way, you do better. You persist, and you graduate. I was a women's studies concentrator as an undergrad. The stuff that I write about and work on now has, maybe it will again as gender studies, as politicians start going after gender studies, maybe I'll start writing about gender again, but I haven't written about gender in ages. But it definitely gave me a space where I could take a philosophy class and think about it through a feminist lens. I could take it this class, and it definitely had a big part in my becoming who I am. And so part of the trouble with DEI is that as our student composition changes, And as our knowledge becomes more international, less European, Western-centric, how does that change what we teach and what we do, and how should it change? So the question of, so DEI offices are one thing, but should faculty be thinking about making sure that they're teaching history from a perspective that allows students to see a little bit of themselves in it? That's an open question. That's a pedagogy question, not a critical race theory, oppressor, oppressed, not the narrative that we're hearing about, right? And I would argue that the knowledge base that we have has grown by virtue of the fact that the composition, who's in the chairs and who's at the table has changed. And I think that really does matter. I mean, when I was a women's studies concentrator, it was in the early 90s. When I went to graduate school, it was Victorian novels, 19th century British literature. So I was an undergrad women's studies concentrator in the late 80s, early 90s. And we didn't have the term intersectionality. We didn't have the term positionality, but we understood that we understood Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, where she writes about how, hey, there's a reason why there's not a lot of Juliet Shakespeare's, because we're washing dishes and putting them. The perspective of what is my actual experience like actually can inform these larger questions. So, but so I'm not someone who stayed in gender studies. But the more I think about positionality, who you are really, if you're Palestinian, second generation of the Nakba, you're gonna experience the conflict in the Middle East very differently than if you're a second generation Holocaust survivor who feels very strongly that Israel has to be an ethno-national state because everybody abandoned Jewish people during World War II. So positionality matters, all of these things matter. Perspectives are not omniscient, universal. They're positioned from particular places. And I think that's a sort of common sense, arguably a common sense, that we only have now because the composition of universities, both at the faculty level and the undergrad level, changed over time.
I think we have time, hopefully, for two more questions. I know you've been waiting, so we'll start with you. Yes, that's right, thank you.
So I'm thinking about competence, the way both of you have talked about it. And I came out of Princeton with a degree in German studies and philosophy. So I've got competence. So
Man, I cannot assume that, but go ahead.
I know someone who got a Ph.D. from Princeton that I don't consider competent.
So
It's not him.
That's all fair.
I didn't get a Ph.D.
That wasn't a jab.
No.
So let's suppose I want to teach Heidegger's 1933 Introduction to Metaphysics.
Right.
So he's just been rector of the university, appointed by the Nazis. And in this text, he argues a lot of things, but maybe most interesting here, that there's a rootedness among German people and the German language that Jews don't have.
Right.
Yeah.
And I believe that. And I want to teach that in class, and I have the competence to teach that in class. So how does this work with my academic freedom?
I will be very brief, and I will say that one of the things that I've been looking at lately is how coordination happened in German universities and what the kind of rationales were that the professors gave themselves and the degree to which they kept insisting that they were still doing it with their own agency. They were choosing it. So Heidegger, there's in one of the famous, the self-assertion of the German university, he says, the much lauded academic freedom, it's better if you choose the law, you give yourself the law. He has this really, really obfuscating, circuitous kind of logic, but all of which is to say that I feel like it's not answering your question at all, but it's to say that we can start to spin theories of academic freedom that nonetheless collaborate with very ugly and allow ourselves to sort of become complicit with very ugly, dehumanizing kinds of logics. So didn't quite answer your question. I'll let Keith answer your question.
So yeah, I'm okay with academic freedom tolerating faculty who collaborate with very, I forgot how you phrased it, but dehumanizing ideologies. Nazis. I'm okay with Nazis.
Viral clip.
My book's about Nazis. Yeah, exactly. Let me qualify that I'm okay with Nazis. So I don't think Nazis necessarily should be fired. But no, so academic freedom in part is about precisely allowing for the possibility of faculty to pursue things that we in fact find deeply morally troubling, including those ideas. The question that I think American universities would also have to confront, and there are, and this is, I think, a necessary confrontation, and I think it's still a point of unresolved tension about how we think about academic freedom in American universities, is how to reconcile them with anti-discrimination laws in various ways. Because it is true that while you might be a very committed philosophical Nazi, for example, and very deeply committed to certain views about Jews, for example, it's still the case we would expect you to conduct your classroom in such a fashion that you treat Jews the same way you would treat any other student in the classroom, for example. And so your conduct in the classroom has to be bounded by a set of legal requirements, I think, as well, professional norms, about how you engage with students, even if your ideas are ones that those very students might find deeply disturbing and offensive in various ways. And I would extend that well beyond, of course, that particular example to lots of other examples as well of where that might lead you in terms of ideas that might get expressed and developed and argued. And part of what universities are precisely places where people can mount those arguments and other people can criticize those arguments, and hopefully we find that those arguments are not good arguments and we can bury them, but we bury them intellectually, not politically. By saying you're not allowed to think that, you're not allowed to talk about that, you're not allowed to discuss that in a university classroom. There's questions about to what degree you can act on that, right? That may be your sincere set of beliefs and commitments. There's a question about what kind of actions you can take on the basis of those beliefs and commitments, but you can certainly teach it and explain it and argue about it and talk about it within a university context, I think. I think that's at the very heart of what academic freedom, I would argue, does not have an exception for ideas we find deeply repulsive.
All right, students have the academic freedom to get to your next class on time. So we're just going to offer you just a brief break. If you have to go, please do that. But we're just going to continue the conversation just for a minute. We have at least one more question. So would you like to ask your question?
So
if I was in a congressional testimony, and
that would have played very
exactly,
badly.
then you should, right? Definitely. That's why I should not be.
Keith is not running for office anytime soon.
That'll be the soundbite. They'll go totally viral.
That's right. Professors trying to run for office is probably not good.
That's why I'm a professor, not a politician.
A lot of what you've articulated is contingent on universities being an intellectual community committed to academic freedom.
Yeah.
So that any particular class is not some sort of perfect balance of all perspectives.
Right.
But that overall the university experience is an intellectual community in which ideas are contested.
Yeah.
Right? And so there has to be a pluralism of views, of perspectives, whether that's disciplinary and specialty or what courses get offered as a function of faculty interests and priorities. And it seems to be part of the legitimacy problem that we're facing with a lot of the public policy issues. We've talked about it as legislatures trying to step in and sort of dictate curriculum, but there's another set of policies that seeks instead to maybe reinforce or restore some of the pluralism of intellectual community on campus and correct what are seen as sort of silos or echo chambers that a lot of disciplines have become. It's hard not to recognize that there's an empirical fact there that university faculties are not remotely representative of the range of ideas that one finds in the political community that they serve. So is it appropriate then for us to think about that? I mean, would it be appropriate to pay some attention to restoring that level of plurality and pluralism in the academic community, including in state universities from state legislatures?
So I think it's not completely outside the bounds. I think, though, that the policies that one would want to think about how to do that would often be counterproductive and fairly crude and troubling as to what the consequences would be for institutions. So one would have to be really careful about trying to think about what kinds of policy solutions are appropriate if you think that's the problem that exists. And I think both private universities and public universities could easily find themselves sort of going through the process of thinking about what are the gaps in our curriculum, what are the gaps in our areas of study, what should we represent differently, and try to correct those in various kinds of ways. I would, I think, say that that I reframe, I think, the way to think about the concern relative to what you just said, which is to say there's a wide range of ideas that are common in the political community. They're not necessarily represented in the university, and I think that's fine. There's no problem with that, which is to say that the goal of universities is to try to represent the range of currently serious intellectual ideas and perspectives that are at play in the scholarly world. And there's all kinds of stuff floating around the community broadly that are not floating around the scholarly world. And we'd say that gap is totally fine to say we don't need to represent all those ideas in the university environment. And likewise, I think demographically, then one has to be a little cautious about how you want to extrapolate from the ways in which universities might not be very representative of the larger community, for example. So if, as is true, university faculty overwhelmingly lean to the left relative to the general American population, certainly relative to populations in certain states, how much of that do we think is actually a problem? I think one has to go through sort of a careful argument, which I've tried to do at one point, and I think it is a problem in some contexts, but one has to actually think carefully through why that might be a problem, and likewise then think about, well, would it be equally a problem if we thought that there were imbalances for race or gender or religion or various other kinds of things where there might be imbalances between what the university faculty look like demographically compared to the communities that they work in more generally. There are some cases in which we might think, no, that's probably reflective of a problem we ought to try to think about how to address. In other cases, maybe not so much. The other, though, wrinkle I would have about this, though, in the diversity stuff, and so Indiana just passed, state legislature just passed a law requiring intellectual diversity in classes, so requiring individual classes to create intellectual diversity. I have a piece that I'm working on now on why that's a terrible idea from a policy perspective. Not clear to me it's unconstitutional, but I think it is terribly interfering with academic freedom and probably bad from a university perspective in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, and probably even counterproductive relative to what the legislators who proposed it wanted to accomplish. But bracket even that kind of very specific issue. Should you have intellectual diversity in your classroom? You framed it in terms of intellectual diversity in your university. Should your university more broadly? So let's take it out of the more politicized context and think about something more specific. So doesn't have the same political salience. So there was a time in which rational choice theory was not common in political science, which borrows from game theoretic and microeconomic accounts of human behavior in general. And political science borrows from all kinds of disciplines, but it was pretty influenced by sociology in the mid-20th century, and in the latter part of the 20th century, increasingly influenced by economics. And so there are a bunch of scholars trying to import in microeconomic ways of thinking into political science analysis in general. And it was an uncommon and popular way of approaching things, and they were cult-like in various ways. And so, yeah, they're not my people. But they have all kinds of insights, and now they're extraordinarily influential, right? So they took over the discipline in all kinds of ways, right? But they started very small, and among the ways in which they started was a place like Rochester Political Science Department, which was a very small department in political science, a small university, not that well regarded as a university for political science stuff, decided we're just going to corner the market on rational choice theorists, and hired some of the best rational choice people of that generation into that department, and that's all they did, right? We're a rational choice shop. And so if you were a student at Rochester, you would get one vision of political science, and it was not the mainstream vision. It was their particular little vision and as a consequence, that department became a highly ranked department, one of the best departments in the country, and produced an extraordinary number of very influential students, precisely because they were specializing in something that had a lot of potential, was not yet fully leveraging that potential. They were playing Moneyball. Right? And so, to borrow a different metaphor. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that for a university to say, we're going to specialize. We're going to play Moneyball, and we're going to do something different. We're going to zig where everyone else is zagging. And if you're a student here, you're not going to be getting everything from everything, because we're not going to give you a full, diverse sort of set range of experiences. We're going to give you the little thing that we've decided to invest in. The concern then, I think, that we ought to have as academics is to say, as a profession, we ought to be intellectually diverse. As a profession, we should not be trying to close off areas of inquiry or say you can only do it this way, but we should be open to people doing it in all kinds of various ways. Even if we decide locally in our particular institution it makes sense to do it this particular way, we know that means we're not going to be a highly diverse institution intellectually in this particular domain, but we think it makes sense for us as how we explore it, and it's going to be useful ultimately for academia as a whole. So part of my concern about sort of these kind of interventions, if you look at a particular institution, for example, and say you're not very diverse on X, Y, and Z dimension, is that that can be counterproductive relative to that particular institution, and doesn't capture, I think, what we ought to be most concerned about, which is what we look like as a larger university. I think, though, it might make sense for a state legislature, for example, to say, or private board trustees at a private university, to say, look, I know you want to play Moneyball and you want to hire all these rat choice guys in the 1960s, and you're very excited by that. But we think that's the wrong investment. That's not what we want to do. Instead, we think the proper thing for our state to do or for our institution to do is do this other different thing. Those choices have to be made, right? There's ultimately going to be investment decisions about where we're going to invest in our particular institutions. And I'm sort of a thousand flowers bloom kind of guy relative to that. I want to see pluralism across the range of university life relative to those things. But it doesn't concern me very much if I look at a particular institution and say this particular institution's not very diverse. That by itself does not bother me particularly. So when there are proposals to come in and say we want to diversify this because we don't like what you're doing, I worry that those proposals are going to be crude and counterproductive, and they may not actually be responding to real problems. Sometimes they might be, and I'm open to that possibility, but they aren't always. And so I want to be very cautious about how to think about those.
Professor Ruth, last word?
Various things that are going to be very predictable for you, but one is self-selection. There's a common sort of cliche that, yeah, if you don't want to make a lot of money and you're conservative, you might try to go into higher ed, but you're more likely to go finance capital or whatever. So it's all, who's working in higher ed is somewhat self-selected at the outset. The question of diversity within one classroom, to me, that is along the lines of the infantilization of adults that's going on in terms of K through 12. I understand in a public school, if I send my kid to a public school in K through 12, I don't want them teaching a particular religion to my school. There should be separation of church and state, and I'm going to get upset. We had a pretty strong consensus for a while that 18 plus, you're adults. You're not going to be instantly swayed by everything that your professor says. You're not going to change your mind. You're not going to become one thing when you were another thing at that level. And there's been a real push for parents' rights at every level. So K through 12, but also in higher ed. When Dan Patrick held his press conference to scold the University of Texas at Austin Faculty Senate for passing a resolution saying, we defend academic freedom to teach critical race theory, he said, parents, do you want your kids, he's talking to parents of UT Austin kids. And he's talking to the parents, not the kids, right? Parents, do you want your kid walking into a classroom and being told that they're the oppressor or the oppressed? So he's totally mangling, right, what critical race theory is in the first place, but we get that. But he's creating that, he's pushing the narrative beyond K through 12 into higher ed. And I think that's really dangerous. And one of the things that AAUP policy says don't indoctrinate, but it also says you have to be candid. They'll suss that out. If I'm trying to sort of speak to two sides of an issue because I've been mandated legislatively to speak to two sides of an issue, I'm not being candid, I'm being forced. And that doesn't create the right kind of community with students.
Well, for those of you remaining, this has been great. And I'd just like to say, stay tuned for more exciting events like this in the future. This is the first of many conversation series on civics, ethics, and the good life. And we look forward to seeing you back. A few more thanks are in order. I'd like to end by acknowledging the support of the Office of the Provost, the UVU Center for the Study of Ethics, and the UVU Center for Constitutional Studies for making this happen. Also, Heterodox Academy for helping sponsor the event. I should put the books back one more time on the screen. I can't get out of here without doing that. And so with that, please join me once more in thanking our guests for a great conversation. Thank you.